He left to teach her a lesson. She sat down to let him learn one. The quarrel that emptied Ravensworth House of its duke on a raw October evening in 1819 had begun, as such quarrels so often do, over something small enough to be almost embarrassing to name, a locked drawer in his study, a question asked once too plainly, a flush of temper neither of them had expected from the other. But it had not stayed small. By the time Edmund Ravensworth stood in his own drawing-room with his greatcoat already on, 3 years of careful marital silence had come apart at the seams between them, and his wife sat very straight in her chair by the fire and told him, in a voice that did not once rise, that she would not chase a man out of his own house to beg him to stay in it. "You will sit there," the Duke said, drawing himself up in the doorway with his greatcoat half-buttoned, "and say nothing at all, while I tell you I am leaving for the evening on business you are not entitled to the particulars of." "I have not asked for the particulars in a fortnight," Edmund, Cordelia said. "I asked once, tonight. Because you have not slept a full night in 3 weeks, and you flinch when the post arrives, and I am your wife, not an ornament in your hall. You may keep your secret, but do not stand there and pretend I am the one making a scene of this evening. You are the one reaching for your coat. I am reaching for my coat," the Duke said, with the particular cold precision of a proud man who knows perfectly well he is in the wrong and has decided pride is warmer, tonight, than admitting it. "Because I find I would rather spend the evening in company that does not interrogate me. I shall return when I return, Duchess, and I do not expect to find you waiting up like a scolding governess when I do." He wanted, though he could not have said so even to himself, to see something crack in her face before he went, a flicker of the fear or the pleading that would have told him his absence still had power over her, still mattered enough to wound. Cordelia Ravensworth gave him nothing of the kind. She reached instead for the little willow-patterned teapot on the tray beside her, the one that had been her mother's, chipped at the spout, and kept anyway, because some things are worth more chipped than replaced, and she poured herself a cup with a hand that did not shake in the slightest, and she said, quite pleasantly, "Then I hope your company is better than your manners this evening, your Grace. Mind the step, it rained this afternoon." The Duke of Ravensworth stood a moment in his own doorway, robbed entirely of the dramatic exit he had rehearsed on his way down the stairs. And then he turned and went out into the wet dark, and the great door closed behind him with rather less force than he had intended it to, because a door slammed at a woman who refuses to flinch loses half its thunder in the slamming. Cordelia sat with her tea and did not weep, and did not pace, and did not send a footman running after him into the night, though every instinct, she owned, screamed to do exactly that, for she knew, better than her husband guessed, precisely how much danger the word business was concealing that evening, and precisely how little his pride equipped him to survive it alone. She had married Edmund Ravensworth 3 years before, in a match arranged with more attention to acreage than affection, 2 strangers brought together over a settlement negotiated by lawyers who had never once asked either of them what they wanted, and she had gone to the altar prepared for a life of civil, distant companionship, and nothing warmer. What she had found instead, in the first awkward months of that marriage, was a man who did not know how to be loved, and had therefore never learned to offer it plainly, but who showed her, in 100 small unspoken ways, a decency she had not been promised and had not expected. She remembered still, with a clarity that ached even now, the winter of their first year together, when a fever had swept the tenant cottages along the eastern boundary, and half the county's great houses had simply sent baskets and stayed well away. Edmund had gone himself, in the worst of it, into cottages other landlords would not have entered, and Cordelia, newly wed and uncertain of her welcome in his life at all, had followed him one grey afternoon uninvited, expecting to be sent home. He had not sent her home. He had looked up from a sick child's bedside, startled and unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him, and said only, "You need not have come," in a voice that meant the opposite entirely, and had made room for her at the bedside without another word, and they had sat up 3 nights together nursing strangers' children, with no more conversation between them than the passing of a cool cloth or a cup. And it was in that silence, oddly, that Cordelia had first begun to love him. Because a man's true character shows plainest in a sick room, no one is watching. And Edmund Ravensworth's had shown her everything she needed to know. But the same silence that had first won her had, over 3 years, hardened into something else, a habit of shutting every hard thing behind a closed door, of managing grief and worry alone the way his father had taught him a Ravensworth managed everything. And Cordelia had watched her husband grow more distant with every private trouble rather than less, until she had begun to wonder whether the man in the sick room had been the truth of him or only a single unguarded hour she would never see again. She had also discovered in the last month that he was drowning in something he would not name, and that a wife with a clear head and a talent for figures, a talent her own father, a country banker, had cultivated in her from girlhood, much as a certain Miss Weston's father had cultivated in his own daughter, some counties distant, could piece together a great deal from what a proud man let slip. She had seen the unfamiliar hand on 3 letters he had burned rather than answered at table. She had seen the sum he had drawn from their joint account, quietly, without explaining it, a sum too large for tradesmen and too specific for gaming debts. And she had guessed correctly that whatever her husband was walking out into that night, he believed he must face it entirely alone, because he had never once in his life learned that a wife's silence could be strength lent rather than judgment withheld. She did not chase him. She had decided, weeks before this quarrel ever came to a head, that if her husband would not open the locked drawer of his own accord, she would simply have to learn to pick the lock herself, quietly, without his knowledge, the way a woman of sense manages a household crisis she has not been trusted to be told about. What Cordelia had already learned in a fortnight of careful looking was this: a Captain Rafe Pemberton, lately of the Foot, a man Edmund had served alongside briefly in his youth and never once mentioned since, had taken rooms in the village and made 2 discreet calls at Ravensworth House while the Duke was from home, and had left, both times, a sealed note that Edmund had read once, gone white over, and burned in the library grate before the ash was cold. She had fished one surviving corner of the second note from beneath the fender before the maid swept it, no more than a scrap, and on it, in a hand she did not know, were the words, "The whole county shall learn what became of your brother at Denby Copse." Unless. Denby Copse. Cordelia knew the name. It was a stretch of woodland on the old Ravensworth boundary where, 9 years before, Edmund's younger brother Percival had died. Of a hunting accident, the family always said, a stray shot in poor light, a tragedy the county had long since stopped discussing out of ordinary decency. Cordelia had never once questioned the story, because there had been no reason to. She questioned it now, sitting with her cold tea and her burned scrap of paper, and she understood, with a banker's daughter's instinct for a figure that does not add, that whatever had truly happened at Denby Copse 9 years ago, her husband had spent every year since paying, in some fashion, for its silence. And that Captain Rafe Pemberton, having lately fallen on hard times and lately learned what a duke's secrets are worth, meant to collect on that silence himself. Before the candles in the drawing-room burned much lower, and they had a long way yet to burn, on that raw October night there was a stretch of quiet in which Cordelia Ravensworth sat alone with a teapot and a scrap of ash-fringed paper, and made the decision that would define the whole of what followed. She would not sit by the fire wringing her hands until her husband chose to trust her. She would go and learn the truth of Denby Copse herself, and be standing, fully armed with it, in whatever room he next needed rescuing from. If a story of a wife who does not chase, but does not wait either, is the kind that keeps you listening, stay. What she found before midnight changed everything her marriage had been built on. She began with the one person in the household old enough to remember that autumn 9 years gone, Hodge, the head groom, who had served the Ravensworths since before either brother could sit a horse, and who Cordelia had noticed more than once a peculiar stiffness whenever Denby Copse was mentioned at all. She found him in the tack room, and she did not plead and did not command. She simply sat down on the mounting block across from him, the Duchess of Ravensworth, in a good wool cloak with mud already on its hem, and told him plainly that her husband was in danger that night from a man threatening to expose whatever had truly happened to Master Percival, and that she meant to help him whether Hodge told her the truth or not, but that the telling would go a good deal faster with his help than without it. Hodge set down the bridle he had been mending and looked at her a long moment in the lamplight, an old man weighing a loyalty of 30 years against a duty he had never once expected to owe a mistress who came to him plain-spoken and unafraid in the middle of the night. "Your Grace ought to be by the fire," he said, not unkindly, "not out here catching your death over old business best left buried." "My husband is out in worse than the cold tonight, Hodge, and I mean to be beside him for it, buried business or no. You have known this family longer than I have breathed. I am asking you to trust me with what you have carried alone, because I think you are as tired of carrying it as he is." Cordelia's voice did not press, it simply waited, steady, the way she had waited by the fire an hour before. And something in that same stillness that had unsettled her husband now, at last, loosened an old man's tongue. "It wasn't no accident, Your Grace," he said, low, not meeting her eye. "Master Percival and a young gentleman of the village had words over a lady, and it came to pistols at dawn in Denby Copse, which is against the law of England plain as day, duelling being forbidden this 30 year and more. The other young gentleman died of it. Percival's shot took him clean, and it was meant to be a mere show of nerve, satisfaction taken, and no one hurt, the way such things are meant to go among fools who ought to know better. It went wrong, and his Grace's father, God rest him, being the old Duke then, paid every soul who knew of it to hold their tongues, and paid the dead man's family a settlement large enough to keep them from the assizes, and told the county it was a hunting accident, and made young Master Edmund, not 28 himself at the time, swear on his own honour never to speak the truth of it to a living soul, for the family's sake, and for his brother's, who died himself not 2 years after, of drink and guilt more than any fever, though that's what the physician called it. The old groom's hands were shaking. His Grace has carried that secret alone since he was a young man, Your Grace, and paid quiet money more than once over the years to keep it buried, because an illegal duel that killed a man is a hanging matter even for a duke's brother, dead or no, and it would ruin the whole family's name besides. I expect that's your Captain Pemberton's business tonight. There's precious few living who know the whole of it. I am one. I expect he found another." Cordelia sat very still in the cold tack room, with the whole shape of her husband's silent years finely laid bare before her. Not a cold man, not a secretive man by nature, but a young man broken at 28 by his own father's terrible bargain, made to carry alone a truth that could hang a family's name, and had already, in its slow poison, helped kill his brother. And she understood, at last, precisely what her husband had been protecting her from every time he reached for his coat instead of his words. He had not been shutting her out of contempt. He had been trying, in the only clumsy way a man raised to silence knew how, to keep the one person he loved from ever having to carry the same weight he had carried for 9 years alone. Where would such a man meet him tonight, Cordelia said, if he meant to press him for money and not simply post a letter? There's an inn on the Denby Road, Your Grace, quiet enough for gentlemen's business, nobody wants seen. The Feathers. If I were a betting man, I'd wager his Grace has gone there tonight, meaning to pay the captain off out of his own pocket, and be done with it. Quiet as his father always did, rather than let it touch you at all. Cordelia Ravensworth rose from the mounting block, and there was nothing left in her bearing of the still, composed woman who had poured her tea an hour before without a tremor. Saddle 2 horses, Hodge. I am not sending a note to my husband. I am going to stand beside him. The old groom hesitated at the tack-room door. Begging pardon, Your Grace, but his Grace will not thank you for it, coming after him like this. He has spent 9 years believing this was his alone to carry. Then he has spent 9 years wrong, Cordelia said, and I find I no longer have the patience to let him go on being wrong, simply because it is easier than correcting a duke. My husband walked out of our house tonight, believing I would sit by the fire and wait to see whether he still loved me enough to come home. He does not yet understand that I have never once doubted that he loves me, Hodge. I have only doubted whether he trusted me, and I mean to answer that question myself tonight, since he seems unwilling to answer it for me. Hodge looked at her a long moment in the lamplight, an old servant taking the measure of a mistress he had perhaps, until that hour rather underestimated himself, and then he went for the horses without another word. The Feathers was a low-smoke dark inn on the Denby Road, its taproom nearly empty at that hour, but for a few silent farmers over their last ale, and Cordelia went past the startled innkeeper and up the narrow stair toward the one-lit private room, without waiting to be shown. Her wet cloak dripping on the boards, her heart going hard and fast in a way her composed face gave no hint of. She arrived to find her husband already there ahead of her, seated across a private table from a lean, handsome, dissolute man in a captain's old coat gone shabby at the cuffs, and the scene she came upon was not the calm transaction Hodge had guessed at, but a Captain Pemberton grown bolder than mere blackmail, demanding now not a single settlement, but a standing annuity for the rest of his. Natural life, and threatening, when the Duke balked at the sum, to go directly to a London newspaper with the whole of Denby Copse before the week was out. She stood a moment unseen in the doorway, and what she saw in that lamplit room struck her harder than anything Hodge had told her in the tack-room, for her proud, cold, controlled husband sat hunched forward over the table, with his hands pressed flat upon it as though to keep them from shaking, and his voice, when he spoke, had none of the icy correctness he wore like armour at home. He sounded, Cordelia thought, exactly like a man of 28 who had once been made to swear a terrible oath, and had spent 9 years since believing himself entirely alone with it. "You will ruin my family," Edmund said, low and furious, and, for the first time in 9 years, entirely without the cold control that had carried him this far. "My brother is 9 years dead, Pemberton. What is served by dragging his name through print now, beyond your own purse?" "What is served," Pemberton said, with the easy cruelty of a man who has found, at last, a lever heavy enough to move a duke, is that I spent my youth soldiering for a country that pensioned me off with nothing, while you spent yours inheriting a title you did precious little to earn, and I find I am no longer inclined to be delicate about the difference. Pay the annuity, Ravensworth, or read your family's name in the London papers by Friday. It was into this raw, cornered moment that Cordelia Ravensworth walked, unannounced, still in her mud-hemmed cloak, and both men turned to her in identical astonishment. "Cordelia, you should not be here," the Duke began, half rising, his whole face a war between relief and horror at being seen this way, cornered and helpless, by the one person he had spent every ounce of his pride trying to shield from exactly this. "I am precisely where I ought to be," Cordelia said, and she did not sit, and she did not tremble. And she looked at Captain Pemberton with the same level composure she had once given her husband over a poured cup of tea. "You are Captain Pemberton. I know the whole of what happened at Denby Copse 9 years ago, Captain, better perhaps than you do. I have had it this last hour from a groom who was there, and I have had, from my own father's accounts and my own eyes, a rather clearer notion than you appear to possess of exactly how thin your position is. You threaten to print a 9-year-old duel in the London papers. Have you asked yourself even once what such a printing would cost you?" Pemberton's easy contempt flickered, uncertain. "I have nothing to lose by it, Duchess. That is rather the point of blackmail." "You have your own neck to lose by it," Cordelia said, "and I do not believe you have thought it through. An illegal duel resulting in death is a hanging matter for every man who participated in arranging it or concealing it, including, Captain, the second who stood for the other side that morning, whose name Hodge remembers a great deal more clearly than you perhaps hoped, and who I am given to understand is one Captain Rafe Pemberton, then a lieutenant, who arranged the whole meeting and has spent 9 years quietly building a case against my husband's family, while conveniently forgetting to mention his own hand in the arranging of it. Print your story in the London papers, Captain, and you will not merely fail to collect your annuity. You will hang beside whatever remains of the Ravensworth name, because I intend, the very morning such a story appears, to lay every particular I have just learned before the nearest magistrate myself, with my husband's full account beside it, and let the law weigh which of you did the greater wrong that morning at Denby Copse." The inn's private room went entirely silent. Edmund Ravensworth stared at his wife as though he was seeing her for the very first time in 3 years of marriage, which, in the way that mattered most, he was. "You are bluffing," Pemberton said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. "I do not bluff, Captain. I keep accounts." Cordelia's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You came here tonight believing you held all the power in this room, because you believed a duke's pride would always pay quietly rather than risk exposure. You did not reckon on a duchess with nothing left to lose by exposure and everything to gain by the truth finally being told plainly, in daylight, by people who did not arrange the killing themselves. Take your annuity idea back to whatever gutter you found it in, sir, and be glad I do not walk out of this room directly to the magistrate tonight instead of giving you the courtesy of a warning." Rafe Pemberton looked from the furious, cornered Duke to the perfectly composed Duchess, and did the swift arithmetic of a man who has just discovered his lever is a good deal shorter than he believed. For a moment his hand moved as though he meant to bluster further, to try the old threat once more on the theory that a woman's nerve would fail where a man's had not. But Cordelia did not move, did not soften, did not so much as blink, and it was that unbroken stillness, more than any word she had spoken, that finally convinced him the game was over. A blackmailer trades on the fear of being seen. He had counted on shame keeping the Ravensworths quiet, and had walked, without knowing it, into the one household in the county that had just decided shame was a currency it no longer meant to spend. He found in the space of 10 seconds that his nerve for ruin did not extend to sharing a scaffold for the privilege of it. "You are a hard woman, Duchess," Pemberton said, low, gathering his hat. "I am an honest one," Cordelia said, "which you will find is a great deal harder to argue with." He gathered his coat and went out into the wet dark without another word, and the innkeeper, some hours later, would report that a Captain Pemberton had settled his account and left the district entirely before dawn, and was never seen in that county again. Edmund sat back in his chair as the door closed, and for a long moment he simply looked at his wife across the ruin of the evening's negotiation, as though seeing, all at once, the whole shape of a woman he had spent 3 years believing he already knew. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth rode home together in the small hours, the wet road pale under a thinning cloud and the first grey hint of dawn not far off, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the horses' hooves loud in the enormous quiet of the sleeping countryside. Edmund kept glancing at his wife as though he could not quite credit the evening, this composed woman in her mud-hemmed cloak, who had ridden alone through the dark to a strange inn and dismantled a blackmailer with nothing but a ledger and a level voice, when he had spent 3 years believing he was the one who managed hard things in this marriage, and she the one who was managed. He found he did not know entirely what to do with the discovery, except that it had cracked something open in him that 9 years of silence had kept carefully shut. "You should not have had to learn that from a groom in a tack room," he said at last, low into the dark. "I should have told you 9 years ago, or 3 years ago when I married you, or any one of 100 nights since when I lay awake beside you and said nothing at all. You should not have had to carry it alone at 8 and 20, Cordelia said, "with a father who taught you that silence was the only honourable currency a Ravensworth man could spend. That is not your failure, Edmund, that is his. But I will tell you plainly what I told Captain Pemberton. I do not bluff, and I do not beg, and I will not spend the rest of our marriage sitting by a fire pretending I have not noticed that my husband flinches at the post. You are not required to carry anything alone in this house ever again. You are required only to let me stand where I have already proven I am capable of standing." They stopped the horses in the drive in the last dark before dawn, and Edmund Ravensworth reached across the space between their saddles and took his wife's gloved hand in his and said the thing he had never once, in 3 years of careful marriage, allowed himself to say plainly. "I love you, Cordelia. I have loved you a good while longer than I have ever admitted, because admitting it meant admitting how much I had to lose, and a man who has already lost a brother to one terrible secret learns to be very afraid of loving anything he might lose to another. I do not want a wife who waits by the fire. I want the woman who rode to the feathers in the mud at midnight and out-argued a blackmailer with a ledger and a magistrate's name. I am sorry I ever walked out that door believing you would crumble. You are the least crumbling person I have ever known, and I am the great fool who married you 3 years before I worked out what I had." The kiss she gave him then, in the grey coming light of the drive, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Cordelia was the plain astonishment of being chosen at last, not for her composure alone, but for the whole of what the composure had always concealed. A woman who did not chase, and did not beg, and had, in the space of one long October night, ridden out and proven she needed neither, because she had gone and rescued him instead. She had married a stranger 3 years before, and spent every season since wondering whether the quiet, decent man from the sick-room winter would ever fully trust her with the rest of himself, riding home in that thin grey light, her husband's hand warm around hers. She understood that he finally had, and that the waiting, whatever it had cost her, had been worth every silent hour of it. By the following spring, the tale of the Duchess of Ravensworth riding to the feathers in the mud at midnight had, in the discreet way such things travel among county households, become a small legend, repeated at dinner tables with the particulars softened, and the courage left entirely intact, so that the Ravensworth name that had once nearly broken over a hidden scandal came, instead, to be spoken of for the steadiness of the woman who had saved it. Edmund told his wife the whole truth of Denby Copse himself, in full, by their own fireside, the week after the ride. The first time he had ever spoken it aloud, without his father's terrible bargain forcing the silence. The fear in his brother's face at dawn, the single shot gone wrong, the old Duke's cold instruction that a Ravensworth man's honour was best served by a lie well kept, and the telling did not ruin them, as he had spent 9 years fearing it would. It only lightened him, the way a weight set down at last always does, and Cordelia listened the whole way through without once looking away. Which was, Edmund told her afterward, the greatest kindness anyone had shown him in 9 years. They took a quieter view of Perceval's memory after that. A modest stone was raised in the churchyard that spring, telling the truth plainly at last in Latin the county would have to trouble itself to translate, and Edmund found he could walk past Denby Copse, without his shoulders going rigid for the first time in 9 years. And one warm evening that summer he took Cordelia's hand and walked the path with her deliberately, the whole way through, naming his brother's boyhood follies and small kindnesses aloud among the trees, as though giving him back, at last, a memory larger than the single terrible morning that had swallowed him whole. Hodge lived another 11 years at Ravensworth, and never once spoke of that night again outside the family, though he took, from that autumn on, a particular pride in grooming the Duchess's own mare with his own hands, a small silent loyalty transferred, and the household understood without being told exactly why. When at last the old groom died, it was Cordelia who sat with him the final night, the way she had once sat with strangers' feverish children in her first winter of marriage, and Edmund who stood in the doorway watching her do it, understanding at last the whole of what he had married and how very long it had taken him to notice. The willow-patterned teapot stayed in its place on the drawing-room tray, chipped spout and all, and Cordelia never did replace it, though her husband offered, more than once, to buy her a dozen finer ones from London. She told him, each time, that she preferred the one that had already proven, on the worst night of their marriage, exactly how steady a hand could pour from it, and that a fine new pot from a London shop had never once out argued a blackmailer at midnight, which was rather more than could be said of the old one. Edmund, who had once slammed a door against that very steadiness and learned, before the candles burned down, precisely what it was worth, took to pouring the tea himself some evenings after, unbidden, setting her cup exactly as she liked it before his own, as his own quiet way of saying what he had once believed a duke was too proud to say at all, that he had gone out that night to teach his wife a lesson, and had come home, instead, having finally learned one of his own, and that he meant, for every evening he had left to him, to go on learning it, gladly, at her own unhurried pace, by whatever fireside she chose to keep.